in author David Goodhart's most recent book, Head, Hand, Heart, Why Intelligence is Over-Rewarded, Manual Workers Matter, and Caregivers Deserve More Respect, Goodhart explains the rise of dominant college-educated so-called cognitive class.
The founder of Prospect Magazine notes that politicians have an academic mindset, and prior to the pandemic, they had an inability to really understand the value of essential workers, and it's arguably do they understand it today. David Goodhart joins us now for more on his new book. Great to have you, David.
Good to see you, David.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
So just lay out the premise that you wanted to explore here in this new book.
Yeah, I mean, the argument is sort of in the title, Head, Hand, Heart. I'm arguing that, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, just too much reward and status has been allocated to one cluster of human aptitudes, that associated with the head, the cognitive, analytical kind of exam passing ability. But I'm sort of making a second related point, which is that, redistributing status across human aptitudes is something that's not really in the gift of politicians, and it seems a rather idealistic, almost new agey kind of thing. But actually, the other part of the argument is much more hard-headed. It's saying we've reached what I call peak head, that it's, the cognitive focus of so much of education, the massive expansion of higher education in recent decades, it's all now become essentially kind of dysfunctional economically and politically and culturally. And obviously we need high intelligence, more than ever before. We need clever people to dig us out of the holes that we've got ourselves into. We need clever teams of people to discover a vaccine for COVID and work out how to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and so on. But it's become too much of the definition of a successful life has become too narrow. You do well at school, you pass exams, you go to college, and you get a kind of professional cognitive job. And that is, because not everybody wants to do that or can do that. And because the economy doesn't actually any longer need all those people, we're creating a great sort of crisis of expectations amongst the people who do go through the cognitive system, many of whom are ending up doing actually pretty routine and non-cognitive jobs. And we're alienating all the people who do kind of heart and hand jobs.
Well, so that's where I want to get with you, David. What did we learn in this pandemic? In a time of crisis, what did we actually learn about how useful so-called people of the head are versus people who work with their hands?
Well, I think we've learned that we're all useful. I mean, that we are interdependent. Mm-hmm. We need the clever epidemiologists and medics to deal with the crisis. But we also discovered they had high status and reward already. What we also discovered is that people who stack shelves in supermarkets are actually pretty central to our lives, and a lot of the people who maintain what one might call the kind of hidden wiring of our lives, the people who drive the vans and take away our refuse and so on, they'd been invisible to a degree. I mean, these jobs are never going to be great jobs, but I think if they're paid reasonably well and people feel well managed and there's the opportunity for promotion if people want it. And if people feel that they have a degree of public recognition, which I think, after the pandemic, they will have, perhaps to an extent that they didn't have before.
And David, part of what you're talking about here isn't just the economic outcomes and how divergent they are for the head versus the hand and the heart. It's also about we've long talked on this show about the real divide between workers is people are treated like human beings fundamentally with wants and desires and needs and creativity and like the full complement of human emotions. And people are basically treated as like automatons or, disposable cogs that can be thrown out whenever you're done with them. That divide dictates who's treated as essentially a worthy human being and who's not. And that's as much at the core, I think, of what you're arguing here as anything else.
Yes, I think that is a real sort of status divide in the kind of occupational hierarchy. One of the problems here is that sort of what one might call the cognitive meritocracy seems to be fair, that the people that get into the top 30% of sort of professional creative jobs, where, as you say, people have a sense of worth and a sort of, their jobs are a form of self-expression often. if you're lucky enough to have one of those kinds of jobs. In order to get into that sort of elevated zone of employment, you obviously have to do well. You have to pass exams, and it seems fair because cognitive ability is relatively easy to measure, whereas other forms, caring, for example, absolutely essential. In aging societies, we have a huge crisis of recruitment in nursing and adult care. And one of the reasons for that is that in some ways we need more meritocracy in those areas, but people tend to think of care jobs as just, they're mainly done by women, so there's a whole sort of gender aspect to it. People think that those jobs, they just come natural. Women are naturally nurturing and caring, so they don't need to be particularly well rewarded. They're often not the main family breadwinner, and so on and so forth. But actually, we need to be able to measure and reward correspondingly outcomes in care. It's very difficult to evaluate and measure the care done by a nurse on a geriatric ward in a hospital.
Yeah, and David, last question. What does this do to democracy, especially across the Western world, where we see this happening in almost every country? What does this mean when you have a representative democracy and this crazy divide in those who are represented and those who are not?
Well, I think it is one of the causes of the mass political alienation that we have seen. I mean, even prior to the pandemic. I mean, indeed, this is what really motivated me to write this book and my previous one, The Road to Somewhere, looking at the value divides in our societies. And I think the domination of the worldview of the cognitively blessed, the cognitively successful, has created a mass political alienation. It gave us Brexit in Britain. It has given us President Trump in the US. It's given us European populism. These are all a kind of reaction against the domination of our culture and our economy and our society by a certain kind of person and someone with a certain set of aptitudes. But my point about peak head is that this is, history is now actually on a hinge, I think. I mean, the pandemic may have speeded it up to some extent, but I think what we are going to see, because it turns out the knowledge economy doesn't actually need very many knowledge workers. I mean, so what sounds like a kind of idealistic notion of shifting status from head to hand and heart is got to happen anyway. It's going to happen because we have massive skill shortages. I mean, in the UK and the US, massive skill shortages in skilled trades, in middling technical functions, and particularly in the care economy. So, and we have declining demand for people, for the kind of cognitive professional class, and we're in the foothills of artificial intelligence. So I do think, I don't want to sound too Pollyanna-ish about this, but I do think there is a sort of corrective coming, which will hopefully do something to reduce that political alienation, that feeling that that we're being ruled by. It's not just a problem of being ruled by the clever; it's also a problem of being ruled by the clever's children, because it turns out that the meritocracy. Cognitive meritocracy easily turns into a kind of oligarchy. I mean, there's a fascinating stat in the latest Michael Sandel book, The Tyranny of Merit, in which he says that I think there are more people at Ivy League universities in the US that come from the top 1% of the income spectrum than for the whole of the bottom 50%. Yeah. So, the cognitive meritocracy is also not working fairly.
Yeah, I think that's well said, and you have a talent for being very prescient in the things that you write, so people should pay attention to what you're saying here and should check out the book. David Goodhart, thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, more rising for you after this.